For 3 straight weeks, Captain Anya Sharma couldn't even apply a pressure bandage without her hands shaking. Not a minor tremor, not the kind of nervous energy you get before a test. This was a deep, uncontrollable shudder that started in her forearms and radiated out to her fingertips, turning the simplest medical procedures into humiliating failures. She'd watch her own hands betray her, fingers fumbling with sterile gauze, dropping 4 needles onto the dusty floor of the training bay, smearing antiseptic in all the wrong places. Each failure was a hot wave of shame that washed over her in front of everyone. Here she was at the military's most advanced combat medic course, a place reserved for the best of the best, and she was performing like a first-year recruit who'd never seen a drop of blood. But before we explain the real reason behind her trembling hands, and the secret that was buried so deep in her file that only one man in the world could unlock it, do us a favor and drop a comment telling us about the toughest skill you've ever had to learn. Hit that subscribe button, because what happened in that final chaotic exercise would not only silence her critics, but reveal a level of skill so profound it would become a base legend. The advanced training facility was a collection of sand-colored buildings baking under the relentless Texas sun. It smelled of disinfectant, sweat, and the faint, metallic tang of simulated blood. Anya arrived with a service record that should have made her an instructor, not a student. Graduated top of her class at medical school, commendations for service in field hospitals, scores on every written exam that were literally off the charts. The instructors read her file and expected a prodigy. What they got was a ghost. A quiet, withdrawn captain with dark, haunted eyes who seemed to shrink every time she was asked to perform. The first major exercise was a trauma lane focused on hemorrhage control. Simple stuff. The mannequin, a gruesome but realistic mock-up of a wounded soldier, was bleeding out from a simulated femoral artery rupture. "Stop the bleed, Captain!" the instructor, Sergeant First Class Miller, barked. Clock's ticking. Anya moved in, her training screaming at her what to do. Pack the wound, apply pressure, secure the tourniquet. But her hands had other ideas. They shook as she tore open the combat gauze, the fine motor skills required to pack the wound tightly, completely abandoning her. The gauze felt like a foreign object in her clumsy fingers. She dropped the roll twice. When she finally managed to stuff it into the cavity, it was loose, ineffective. The simulated blood just kept pumping, pooling on the concrete floor. From across the room, another student, Major Martin Vance, let out an audible sigh of disgust. Vance was a surgeon, a rising star with an ego as sharp as his scalpels. He was a man who believed the world was divided into 2 groups, assets and liabilities, and he'd already decided which one Anya was. For God's sake, someone show her how to pack a wound before the patient dies of embarrassment, he muttered to his small circle of admirers, just loud enough for half the room to hear. It got worse. During the 4 insertion drills, her hands trembled so badly she couldn't hit a vein on the training arm. She'd poke and prod, the needle shaking, missing the mark again and again while the soldier next to her had already successfully placed 3 lines. The instructor eventually had to step in. "Captain, maybe take a break. Get some water." It wasn't a suggestion. It was a dismissal. She spent the rest of the drill cleaning equipment, the burning humiliation feeling worse than any physical wound. The whispers followed her everywhere. They say she was a top-tier doctor stateside. What happened? One student would say, "Maybe she can't handle the pressure. Some people are just built for the clinic, not the field," another would reply. Vance was less subtle. He made it his personal mission to comment on her every failure. In the chow hall, he'd talk loudly about how standards were slipping, how people who couldn't perform basic tasks were putting everyone else at risk. He never used her name, but everyone knew who he was talking about. He called her the ghost because she was already fading away, or sometimes Shaky Sharma. He was a predator who smelled blood in the water, and he circled her constantly, his condescending smile and quiet put-downs chipping away at whatever confidence she had left. Anya never reacted. She just ate her meals in silence, her gaze fixed on her tray, her posture rigid. She built a wall around herself, brick by brick. With every failed task, and every mocking comment. But inside that fortress, she was trapped with the one thing she couldn't escape, the memory of why her hands wouldn't stop shaking. She was isolated, a pariah in a place where teamwork meant survival. The instructors had already started the paperwork for a medical review board. In their eyes, she was broken, a brilliant mind trapped in a body that could no longer do the job. She was a liability, and in their world, liabilities get cut loose before they get someone killed. Not everyone saw failure. Command Sergeant Major Mike Reyes saw something else entirely. Reyes was a fixture at the training center, a quiet, observant man who had spent 20 years as an Air Force pararescueman, a PJ. He'd seen every kind of soldier imaginable, from the cocky and loud to the quiet professionals. He'd learned to read people not by their words or their test scores, but by their habits, their muscle memory. And what he saw in Captain Sharma didn't add up. Publicly, she was a mess. But in private, when she thought no one was watching, she was different. Reyes saw it in the way she maintained her gear. Her medkit wasn't just organized, it was laid out with a kind of obsessive, tactical precision. Every pouch, every tool, every bandage was placed for immediate, non-visual access. It was the medkit of someone who had worked in complete darkness, under fire, where fumbling for a piece of gear for 2 seconds could mean the difference between life and death. He saw it in the way she moved. In the chow hall, she always took a seat with her back to the wall, a clear view of all entrances and exits. It was an old habit, a creature comfort for those who've spent too much time in dangerous places. During briefings, her eyes weren't just on the speaker. They were constantly, subtly scanning the room, tracking movement, assessing the space. It wasn't paranoia. It was a deeply ingrained threat assessment protocol. Reyes had seen hands like hers before. Not the shaking, but the hands themselves. When she cleaned her rifle, a task she performed with methodical grace. Her fingers moved with a fluid, confident economy of motion that completely contradicted her fumbling during medical drills. These weren't the hands of a clinic doctor. They were the hands of a warrior, someone whose body knew violence and trauma on a cellular level. Reyes didn't know her story, but he knew a cover story when he saw one. The file said she was a surgeon from a base hospital. The soldier he was watching told a very different tale. He decided to keep his observations to himself, waiting. He knew that sooner or later, the truth has a way of showing up, especially under pressure. The pressure arrived during the first major team-based exercise, a mass casualty or MASCL simulation. It was designed to be chaos. Smoke, strobing lights, speakers blasting the sounds of a battlefield, and a dozen role players with horrific, moulaged injuries screaming for help. The goal was to test triage, the brutal, lightning-fast process of deciding who lives, who dies, and who has to wait. Anya was assigned to Major Vance's team. "Oh, fantastic," Vance said with a dripping sarcasm that made his cronies snicker. "Just what we need. A wild card." The exercise was a catastrophe from start, and Anya was at the center of it. Faced with the overwhelming sensory input, her tremors went into overdrive. She was assigned to a patient with a sucking chest wound, a critical but manageable injury. She just needed to apply a chest seal. But her hands shook so violently she couldn't get the wrapper open. The plastic crinkled mockingly in her trembling fingers. "Sharma, move." Vance yelled over the din. "We don't have all day." The patient, a young soldier playing his part, was screaming. The instructor with the clipboard was watching, his pen hovering over the fail column. Anya froze. For a split second, she wasn't in a Texas training bay. She was somewhere else. A dark, dusty place that smelled of sand and cordite. The memory hit her like a physical blow, and her hands clenched into useless fists. Vance shoved her aside. "Get out of the way. You're going to kill him." He treated the patient himself, his movements fast and angry. The team failed the exercise. They had the highest number of preventable deaths in the class. At the debrief, Vance didn't hold back. "We failed because one member of this team is not fit for duty," he announced, his eyes locked on Anya. "She is a danger to herself and to any soldier who has the misfortune of needing her help." The instructors didn't disagree. The official notice was posted that evening. Captain Sharma was scheduled for a final evaluation. One more failure, and she would be permanently removed from the program. Her career was hanging by a thread. The day of Anya's final evaluation felt less like a test and more like a formality. An execution. The scenario was the toughest one they had. A multi-vehicle ambush with over 20 critically wounded casualties scattered across a simulated kill zone. It was pure, unadulterated chaos by design, meant to push even the most seasoned medics to their breaking point. For Anya, it was supposed to be the final nail in her coffin. The air was thick with tension and the smell of diesel from the burning vehicle props. As the teams assembled, a black, unmarked sedan rolled onto the observation deck. The kind of vehicle that signals the arrival of someone from a much higher pay grade. A man stepped out. He wasn't in uniform, but he moved with the quiet, coiled intensity of a man who was intimately familiar with violence. He was tall, lean, with silver hair and eyes that seemed to miss nothing. He was Colonel Declan Cole, a legendary Delta Force surgeon whose name was spoken in reverent whispers in the special operations community. No one knew why he was there. He simply stood on the deck, arms crossed, watching. The exercise began. It was worse than anyone imagined. The sheer number of casualties was overwhelming. Medics were running from patient to patient, their resources stretched thin. Vance's team was in the thick of it, and he was performing brilliantly, a whirlwind of decisive action. But even he was getting bogged down. There were simply too many dying soldiers. In the middle of it all was Anya. She was assigned to the triage station, but she was frozen again. A young soldier lay in front of her, his leg barely attached, arterial blood pumping out in rhythmic spurts. Her hands were shaking so badly, she couldn't even grip the tourniquet. She was useless, a statue of failure in a sea of desperation. Vance saw her and just shook his head, moving on to someone he could actually save. The instructor made a note on his clipboard. It was over. But on the observation deck, Colonel Cole wasn't watching the chaos. He was watching Anya. He walked down from the deck, moving with a calm purpose that seemed to bend the chaos around him. He didn't speak to the instructors. He didn't speak to Vance. He walked directly through the smoke and noise until he stood right beside the frozen Captain Sharma. He knelt down, his voice low but clear, cutting through the noise like a surgeon's blade. "Captain Sharma," he said, his eyes locked on hers. "This scenario is compromised. The casualty count exceeds standard protocols." He paused, and then delivered the words that would change everything. "I'm authorizing protocol, Nightingale." It wasn't a shout. It wasn't a dramatic command. But for Anya, it was like a key turning in a lock deep inside her soul. The transformation was instantaneous and absolute. The shaking in her hands didn't just lessen, it vanished. The haunted, distant look in her eyes was replaced by a laser-like focus of impossible clarity. She blinked once, and the ghost was gone. What was left was the professional. She didn't say a word. She just moved. Her hands, once traitorous, were now a blur of terrifying efficiency. She grabbed the tourniquet and applied it high and tight on the soldier's leg, cinching it with a grunt of effort that stopped the bleeding instantly. 1 second. Done. She was already moving to the next patient. It was like watching a grandmaster play chess while everyone else was still learning the rules. She moved through the kill zone with an almost supernatural grace, her mind a supercomputer of medical knowledge. Triage tags appeared in her hands, slapped onto chests with unerring accuracy. She performed a needle decompression, plunging a long needle straight into a soldier's chest to reinflate a collapsed lung. In the time it took most medics to open the damn package. She established an IO line, using a handheld drill to go straight into the shin bone of a burn victim. A brutal procedure to pump fluids into him when his veins were gone. Every action was precise, economical, and brutally effective. She wasn't just treating patients. She was conducting an orchestra of survival. "Ew," she barked at a stunned medic. "Give me 3 units of Oneg now. You, start bagging this one. He's not breathing on his own." Her voice was steel, confident, unquestionable. Vance just stood there, his jaw slack, a half-applied bandage in his hands. He was watching someone operate on a level he didn't know existed. He'd built his career on being the best, the fastest, the smartest surgeon. And he was now watching this woman, this shaking woman, single-handedly turn a mass casualty nightmare into a controlled clinical environment. In under 10 minutes, she had triaged, stabilized, and directed the evacuation of every critical patient. The chaos was gone, replaced by a quiet, orderly hum of efficiency. The exercise wasn't just saved. It was dominated. The debriefing room was small, windowless, and silent. The only people present were the base commander, a stunned Command Sergeant Major Reyes, and Colonel Cole. Captain Sharma had been escorted to a private room to decompress. The lead instructor presented the results of the exercise, his voice filled with a mixture of awe and confusion. Anya Sharma hadn't just passed. She had set a new record for efficiency and survivability in the Maskell scenario. A record that was, by all accounts, statistically impossible. The commander turned to Cole, his expression demanding an explanation. "Colonel, what the hell did I just witness?" Cole took a sip of his coffee, his gaze steady. "You witnessed what happens when you take the leash off a true operator, Commander." He slid a thin, heavily redacted file across the table. Captain Sharma's file is mostly a work of fiction, a cover story. She was never a surgeon at a base hospital. For 5 years, she was the lead medic for a Tier 1 pararescue team. A PJ. Reyes's eyes widened. He'd known it. He'd seen the ghost of the operator in her habits. Her unit operated in places that don't officially exist. Cole continued, his voice low. They were sent in when things went catastrophically wrong. Her job wasn't just to be a medic. It was to be a miracle worker in hell. Her record is unbelievable. On one mission, after her team was hit, she kept 4 of her teammates alive for 72 hours with little more than what was in her medkit. She's a legend in a community that doesn't talk about its legends. The commander was speechless. Then why the shaking? Why the failures? Cole's expression softened slightly. Because heroes break, Commander. 2 years ago, on a mission in the Hindu Kush, her helicopter went down. She was the sole medic for over a dozen casualties, both American soldiers and local civilians. She worked for 18 hours straight, but resources were non-existent. She was forced to triage not just the wounded, but her own conscience. He paused, letting the weight of the words fill the room. She had to make a choice. 2 of her own teammates were dying. She only had enough plasma for 1. She had to choose which of her friends would live and which would die in her arms. She saved 1. The other wasn't so lucky. That's the ghost she lives with. The trauma manifested physically. High stress, mass casualty situations trigger a psychosomatic tremor in her hands. It's a form of PTSD. In protocol, Nightingale, Reyes asked quietly. Cole nodded. It's a psychological fail-safe developed for operators with specific trauma triggers. It's a deep state conditioning phrase. When an authorized officer gives the code, it acts as a cognitive override. It bypasses the emotional, trauma-linked part of her brain and gives her direct access to her procedural memory, her training, her muscle memory. It doesn't heal the trauma. It just puts the ghost in a cage for a little while so the operator can do her job. It's a last resort, and I was the one who authorized its use today because I knew what she was capable of. You weren't watching a broken soldier. You were watching one of the finest combat medics this country has ever produced, fighting a war on 2 fronts, one in front of her and one inside her own head. The revelation of Anya's past sent ripples through the entire training center. Her file was unsealed, her real one, and the quiet captain who couldn't hold a needle steady was suddenly revealed to be a highly decorated war hero. The nicknames Shaky Sharma and the Ghost died instantly, replaced by a wave of silent, profound respect. No one felt the change more acutely than Major Vance. The arrogant surgeon, who had built his identity on being the best, had been humbled in the most public way possible. He had watched someone he dismissed as incompetent operate on a level of pure instinct and skill he knew he could never achieve. He found her the next day, not to apologize. Words felt cheap and inadequate, but to learn. He saw her cleaning her medkit and simply asked, "The way you triage that wasn't in any textbook I've ever read." How did you know the order? Anya looked up, her eyes clear for the first time in weeks. You don't learn it from a book, she said, her voice steady. You learn it by listening to the dying. Vance just nodded, the lesson landing harder than any reprimand. He went from being her harshest critic to her most dedicated student overnight. The dynamic of the entire class shifted. People didn't just respect her, they revered her. Anya's dismissal orders were shredded. In their place came a flood of offers, including a return to the special operations community. She respectfully declined them all. Instead, she accepted a position to stay right there at the training center as the new lead instructor for the advanced trauma course. She decided that the best way to honor the friend she'd lost was not to go back into the field, but to forge the next generation of medics who would. She would teach them not just how to save a life, but how to live with the ones you can't. Her scars, she realized, were now part of her strength, a map of where she'd been and a guide for those who would follow. So what do you think? Have you ever witnessed someone who seemed ordinary reveal an extraordinary hidden talent under pressure? Do you believe a psychological trigger like Protocol Nightingale is a necessary tool for elite soldiers? Or does it risk papering over deep trauma that needs to be healed? And what would you have done if you were Major Vance, after seeing everything you thought you knew about skill and competence turn upside down in an instant? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. We read every one. If this story reminds you that the quietest people often carry the heaviest burdens and the greatest strengths, hit that like button and subscribe for more stories about the heroes hiding in plain sight. This is a story that proves the deepest scars often hide the greatest strength.